One of the things I often say to people is that market research is an ongoing process if you're an author. And in fact, I call it market awareness more than market research. I like to think of the fact that we need to be aware of our market, aware of what's going on around us. We make most of our time for writing because that's what we love, but we also have to look up from our keyboards occasionally and see what other people in our genre are doing, see how readers are responding to it, and think a little bit about how that affects us.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author Podcast, I talk with Nat Connors about understanding your book's neighborhood. We discuss the importance of understanding what books you want your book to appear next to, and how authors can use data to guide their publishing decisions about positioning their books, including wide versus KU, series versus standalone, pricing, cover design, blurbs, and compliance with genre conventions. We discuss the importance of tracking the best practices in your genre, how to solicit input from readers to get the most valid results, and using categories to educate the retail platforms about your books. And Nat has a special offer for listeners of the Indy Author Podcast. And a quick request before we get to the interview, if you've gotten value from the podcast, please leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform to help others find it. And now, let's hear from Nat Connors about understanding your book's neighborhood. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Nat Connors. Hey, Nat, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty. It's great to be back.
It is lovely to have you here. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Nat is a romantic comedy writer, medical scientist, and dance teacher, and creator of the Kindletrends newsletter for genre fiction authors. Kindletrends started when he got fed up with trying to make sense of the Kindle store and wanted a no-nonsense summary of the most important information. Nat uses the Kindletrends information to plan his own writing, publishing, and book launches, so it has to be focused, relevant, and actionable. And I invited Nat back to the podcast. He's been a previous guest to talk about the state of the genre. And we're going to be talking generally about what is the data that every author should be tracking related to their own genre, but because it's always more fun to talk about something specific than something general and theoretical, we're going to be talking about fantasy. I figured I talked so much about crime fiction, it was time to talk about something different. But if you're not a fantasy author, I would recommend you not tune out, because the information we're going to be sharing is something that is applicable to really any kind of genre fiction that listeners may be working on. And so, Nat, I'm just going to ask you to sort of step back and talk generally about how people should be looking at the data that's available to them out there in order to better plan their writing and publishing work. And then we'll dive into the details of a couple of pieces of data that you specifically recommend people look at.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, as Matty and many others will know, about how you go about getting your head around all of the things that are going on in your genre and in your sort of subgenre and the specific environment that you're in. And I've got a bunch of stuff that I've sort of written about this, about ways to take a very big problem and divide it up into sort of little chunks. Because when you're looking at a whole genre, something like fantasy, which has got so many different aspects to it and so many different moving parts, it can be a bit overwhelming. You know, you read some books and you think, well, I like this, but do other people like this? Is this, So I've found having a way of listing the things that I need to look at and the things I need to think about helps me feel like I'm getting around stuff and I'm kind of not missing anything. One of the things I often say to people is that market research is an ongoing process if you're an author. And in fact, I call it market awareness more than market research. I like to think of the fact that we need to be aware of our market, aware of what's going on around us. We make most of our time for writing because that's what we love, but we also have to look up from our keyboards occasionally and see what other people in our genre are doing, see how readers are responding to it, and think a little bit about how that affects us, So I've got a few different things that I sort of go through step by step when I'm looking at what's going on in my genre. And we're going to do that sort of bit by bit with fantasy, but to try and generalize it at the same time.
Well, one of the things that I think is top of mind for many authors who are deciding what route to take for their publishing is the whole question of wide versus KU. And my understanding is that this is very genre dependent, that there are just genres that historically have proven to do well in KU and genres that are proven not to do well in KU. And I think that would be a great point to start. If people are
Yeah.
deciding whether they want to go the KU route or not, what pieces of information do you recommend they be aware of in order to make that decision?
Yeah, that's a very good place to start, Matty. I think that there's a bunch of factors, and some of those factors, just stepping away from the market, are also to do with you, the writer, and your own preferences for where you want to market and sell your work, and also for the length and the tempo at which you prefer to write. I'd never want anyone to feel like they have to do a particular thing if they want to be in any genre. It's absolutely true that some genres have traditionally been quite heavily KU, but we've also seen that changing, I think. And when we look at the fantasy, what we'll see is that there are some subgenres in fantasy which are quite all in on KU, but there are others which are pretty much 50-50. And so I guess I'd put it down to a couple of factors. As far as the individual author is concerned, as we know, KU pay rates are per page. So if you tend to write longer, then relatively speaking, KU is going to be a better bet for you. So a good example there is Lit RPG, which has really exploded in popularity over the last, 4 years, 5 years, I think. I probably first heard the term about 2019, just before the lockdown. Now, and then that was a subgenre that was always around before that, but it sort of got this name and suddenly exploded in popularity. Lit RPG books, my colleagues who write in that genre tend to run quite long. And by quite long, I mean more than 100,000 words. They are often sort of in serials. So I think that has contributed to them being in KU quite a lot. On the other hand, there's a lot of shorter fantasy, and there are a lot of more traditional sort of swords and sorcery fantasy books that are published by small publishers, not by the big four, but in that situation, they are more often wide. So another factor for authors to consider, I think, in terms of KU versus wide, as well as their writing tempo, is also how much they want to spend time on marketing to different stores. There are great services now like Drafted Digital, which will make it very much easier for you to get your books onto a multiple of stores. But then, of course, remember there's the exclusivity agreement. So if you are wide, then you are prevented from having your books in KU for a 3-month period. We also know then that quite a few authors have practiced putting books in KU for the first 3-month period and then taking them out and going wide.
Yeah, I think that one of the areas that I, as someone who is not in KU, have benefited from being aware of the KU versus Y distinction is when I'm running BookBub ads. And I know that
Yep.
I would go through and I would find other authors who are successful in my genre, which is, mystery, suspense, thriller, and I would run BookBub ads against them. But one thing that I realized very quickly I had to check was whether they were in KU or not, because I realized that running a BookBub ad, now I'm talking about ads, not feature deals, but running a BookBub ad against a KU author's audience when I myself am not in KU is probably targeting the wrong group, because KU readers are looking for something different than people who are not KU readers. And so I feel like, if I had spent money on advertising to KU author followers, then I probably would have been not using my advertising dollars to the best effect, because I'm advertising to people
Yeah.
who aren't used to interacting with getting content in that way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think also there, my instinct is that it is less a matter of the difference in terms of what people are looking for, and maybe a bit more the simple fact that they have already paid for KU. So for them to pay extra money for a book, it's much more difficult for them to justify.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right that targeting, if you're not a known author to them, it's much less likely that they're going to take a punt on your book rather than taking a punt on another book that's actually in KU already. It's interesting also, and I don't know if you heard this, but as a romance author, traditionally, like 5 years ago, it was very difficult to get a BookBub if you were in KU. There was a belief, true or otherwise, there was a belief that you were much more likely to get one if your books were wide than in KU, and you could get them if you're in KU, but you had to be a very heavy hitter. Was that a belief in mystery and suspense as well? I think it's changed a bit
Not that,
now, and I've seen, it's
yeah,
much
not
more
that I've
50-50.
heard of. And I also think that it's important to point out to people who aren't familiar with BookBub that I think you're talking about feature deals. So there's
Yeah,
these
sorry.
sort of two approaches to BookBub. One is to apply for a feature deal, which is quite challenging to get and expensive if you land it, and then ads, which anyone can run. But
Yeah, no,
it
that
could well be. I just don't recall hearing chatter
yeah,
about that in my genre.
yeah. So talking about the wide versus KU distinction in the case of fantasy, what we can see just looking at the data that I've got in front of me now is that actually for the top 200 books in all of fantasy, they're actually pretty much 50-50 wide versus KU. If you look at this sort of split across other genres like, say, paranormal romance or urban fantasy, then you'll find a much higher proportion of KU book compared to wide. But across all of fantasy, it's actually pretty much 50-50 at the moment. Now, in the case of fantasy, there's a couple of reasons for that. And probably one of the most common ones, or the most obvious ones, is that there are quite a lot of trad published fantasy books in the top 200. Those are the ones which tend to be more wide. So we've got a situation where kind of 50% wide, 50% KU, but the KU half is mostly indie, and the wide half is much more trad. So that another factor I think for listeners is if you are interested in being trad published now or in the future, then that might affect your decisions about whether you're in KU or wide. Of course, your commitment to enrollment in KU is only a 90-day commitment, so there are always options to change things later on. And I think, and we'll see this when we get to the covers, I think in the past there was a much bigger distinction between KU covers and wide covers. It was generally believed that you sort of had to recover your books if you were going to go wide, otherwise they wouldn't sell. I think that's much less the case now than it has been in the past.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'll look forward to that. As a cover designer, and I'll look forward to that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is, people can just choose to go wide or KU based on their business plans and their goals. The other piece of data that you recommend people look at is series versus standalone. And this is
Yes.
usually not something that people are like, some people who are really organized are actually making this as a decision. But I think many authors, if they're like me, are like, you finish your book and you're like, now I realize it's one or the other. So can you talk a little bit about when people are looking at data and using fantasy as an example, and they're looking at the series versus standalone, what are you recommending people look at there?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, another, I guess, kind of obvious thing is that if you are in mind to write a series or you're continuing a series, then KU in some ways is a bit more appealing because if people like your work, it's very easy for them to binge and to just keep reading the next book in the series and the next book and the next book. And as a lot of listeners will know, often, whether you're in KU or not, people in the past have priced the first book in their series quite low, so 99 cents or 2.99, in order to encourage people to kind of take a gamble on it. And then when you get them interested in your writing style and you get them invested in your characters, then you can kind of carry on, Um, however, of course, planning out a series is a lot of work, and it's quite reasonable, I think, to start. I've certainly done this, to start something without really knowing whether the world has got enough in it for you to write a compelling series. I think not every long series or even series of just a couple of books starts out that way. So I think, and also, in fact, again, when we get to covers, we'll see that if you have a series that places different constraints on your cover design, because as we know, we want the covers to be linked in one way or another. And when we look at a cover montage, you can really see examples of things where there's a bunch of books in a series and you want it to be very clear to the reader that that's what's going on.
Yeah. The pricing conversation is interesting because
Mm.
we're recording this in the middle of 2024. At the end of 2023, I made a change to my pricing because, everything was getting more expensive.
Yeah.
And for a long time, my pricing model was that for my nonfiction books, my first in series book was $2.99, and then the subsequent books were $4.99. And I started feeling like, not only do I, is it nice to get more money for each book, but I felt as if the pricing sort of defines the the books that you want to be compared with.
Yeah.
And now many of the traditionally published ebooks are $14.99, and there are reasons that indie authors are not doing
Mm.
that because we get penalized for pricing a book over $9.99. but I put up all my post first in series ebooks to $6.99, and then I increased my first in series to $3.99, which I still feel as if it's a price that I as a reader am willing to take a chance on.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of a benefit that indies have. I mean, it's unfortunate that we're in a sense being forced to do this because of the Amazon rule that if a book is priced over $9.99, then you get a lower royalty rate. But it also makes it, I think, easier for readers to say, "Oh, here's somebody that, this looks interesting, but I don't know them, but, I wanna check it out." And having that lower cost of entry to the series, I think, is really smart.
Yeah, that's true. I think also in your case, Matty, and I know I've said this a lot in the past, your covers and your branding is very kind of classy. So it looks, and I'm not just saying that, it looks like it's done by a trad house. It looks like books that should be on the shelf next to some of the sort of famous trad mystery authors. And that's a specific branding decision. And I think it's a great, yeah, no, look, fantastic. I've always been a big fan of your covers, but it does that's one decision, and there are other decisions. But I think for where you are at and for the price point that you're talking about, particularly since, as you've said, and we'll see, prices across most all genres, I think, have been steadily marching upwards over the past 4 years or so, which is great news. Because of that, I think you're absolutely right that your books can stand at $5.99, or, like a higher price point.
Yeah, I'm sort of fascinated with this topic lately of what what do you want what books do you want to show up next to yours? And, when I think about the books that I would love to have my books show up next to, many of them are traditionally published, and so you're sending a message one way or the other to your audience based on the kinds of information that you're putting on you know,
Yep.
the quality of your not the quality of your cover, but the style of your cover, and
Yes,
it's
yes.
all messages that you're sending to your potential reader.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's a question of a sort of visual language and the pricing and the language in your blurb and so on and so forth. So I'd never, and I think we'll talk more about comps as well, I'd never say to any author that they have to do exactly the same things that their comp authors or comp titles do. But I would always say that you need to be aware of them, because if you want to be seen next to those books in also boughts and also reds and those kinds of things, and in ads, then you need to be aware of what they're doing. And to some degree, you need to align with it. I guess that's the point. I'd say you've got to align with what those, in your case, those trad authors are doing. You don't have to copy it, but you've got to not kind of go against it, as it were.
Yeah. Well, we keep referring to cover design, and I'm going to seize the opportunity. And now we're going to go slightly off the fantasy thing because I'm very interested in this currently because for my Lizzie Ballard thrillers, I had covers that I love, lovety love. Like when I hold one
Mm.
of those print books in my hand, I just, it gives me good goosebumps because I think they're lovely
Yep.
covers. But what I realized was that first of all, the subtleties that make the print covers lovely are kind of lost in the tiny thumbnails online. And then the other thing I realized is that in some ways they were sort of almost more fantasy-esque than they were thriller-esque. And I'm just
Mhm.
having them redone, and I'm starting to be
Mm.
like, I don't have data yet to because the rebranding is in process. The cover designer I'm working with is working through the series to update the covers. But I'm starting to be a real believer in the idea of you really need to revisit your covers maybe every 5 years, because I always recommend that people subscribe to an email newsletter like BookBub or Bargain Books a Year, Free Books a Year, one of those, eReader News Today, Fussy Librarian, there are many of them out there. Subscribe as a reader to your own genre,
Mm.
because oftentimes the trends in the cover are so starkly evident when you look at the list. And I
Yep.
would pull up my daily BookBub newsletter for mystery, thriller, or suspense, and I was like, I don't I don't know, like, my book cover isn't looking like it fits in with these books now,
Mm.
and
Mm.
you have these trends that come and go, like, for a long time with a thriller, it was the woman in the yellow jacket running away. I don't know what about Yellow Jacket was so popular, but I finally just thought, I have to stop being sort of emotionally tied to the beautiful covers that I love and say, that was fine, but it's not what I need to be doing in 2024. Can you talk
Yeah.
more generally about advice you would give to people on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first, I always love those covers. And I think that was maybe one of the first things I said to you when we first started talking some years ago was, wow, those are really classic covers. But yes, you're absolutely right. The thing is, new books come out all the time. And what that means is those books, the readers read them, and those books will change readers' expectations of what is being communicated, the visual language of particular elements or colors or devices on the page. That changes over time because, of course, it does. And so, what your book, what anyone's cover is communicating in 2018 or 2019 is not what it is going to be communicating to readers in 2024. Those things don't change overnight. And, I'd never say that you have to constantly be changing your covers because I think sometimes that could be confusing as well as expensive and a lot of work. But the time frame that you're talking about, Matty, I think is absolutely right. And you're very right that subscribing to reader-focused newsletters is a great way to see, a low-effort way to see what other people are doing, because you can, as you say, you can imagine your book next to them and say, well, does it fit in? And you, like, if you will see, I suspect probably you were seeing books that if you read the blurb or the ad, they sounded like your books, they sounded like a potential comp, but the cover was completely different, So you're sort of thinking, well, hang on, this looks like my kind of book. It looks like my reader's kind of book, more to the point. But my cover is speaking a really different language to this book, which is kind of coming out now. And again, you don't have to change absolutely everything, but it pays to sort of be aware of that. And some of the best redesigns, I think, that I've seen have been quite subtle ones, where they're kind of updating things, but they're keeping what was good about the original cover, You can see this a lot in fantasy and in some other speculative fiction genres with the trend towards what are called discrete covers. I think maybe we've talked about this a little bit in the past, that there are now a lot more covers that have objects or sort of symbolic representations of them, of things on them. A bit like the classic example, I think, from a long time ago was the Harry Potter books, that the first editions had illustrated covers, and then there were some more ostensibly more adult images of symbols and things, and you can see the difference, and they convey different things in a way. That's happened for a lot of people in fantasy now, and in fact, when we look at a montage of all of the fantasy books, we can see a lot more of those discrete object style covers that they often include things about the nature of the story, and they also, just going back to the issue of series, a discrete or object style cover often makes it quite easier for you to have a common through line in terms of having similar elements or complementary elements on a particular series. So if you've got a series of objects or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, the Harry Potter one is interesting because my guess is that when they were first putting out the first book, and that was very much targeted at children, that they came up with that illustrated idea, and then they had to kind of carry it through. But then I think my guess is that when they realized what appeal that had to adult readers, they wanted to readjust it a little bit to make it less, like, not cartoonish, but more serious. I'm not coming up with exactly the right term I want to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that somebody in their sort of 20s and 30s and 40s would be more likely to go into a bookstore and pick up. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think also if we look at the history of all of the covers of a sort of a very famous book or book series, we can see these changes as well. So one reason to change covers, of course, is to appeal to a different market segment. But another one is the thing that you were saying about your books, that even if you're trying to appeal to the same people that you were 5 years ago, their expectations have changed because of all of the other books coming out. And now, just looking at the cover montage, now we can see that Fae, or books about Fae or elves, will often have these kind of symbolic discrete covers, whereas in fantasy lit RPG books will often have more cartoon illustrated type covers, actually more similar to the old Harry Potter books in some way.
Yeah. And we're going to be talking eventually about an easy way people can see all this information, but a good available resource for people would just be to go to your favorite online retailer, go to your genre, look at the top however many books, top 100 books or whatever, and try to picture your book cover among those and see if it makes sense to you, visual sense to you or not.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's okay with you, Matty, in the show notes, we'll list a couple of free tools which I've got, which will make it very easy for you to just download that kind of information. So to download a cover montage and the simplest things, if you're very short on time, then the things that I would recommend would be one, as Matty says, sign up to relevant newsletters in your genre, scan them because that's what your readers are seeing. And the other one is go to the relevant top 100s in your genre, download the cover montage, and just look at that. That's a very short job every week. And once you do it for a month, you'll start seeing a whole lot of little changes, and those changes can be quite profound.
Yeah. And I think maybe a good news for indie authors is that something I've noticed in my BookBub emails is that I'll see the same authors come up over the course of a month, over the course of a couple of months. The same authors pop into those. And the covers from book to book are very similar. The overall design is, in a sense, almost identical, but maybe the colors are slightly different. I'm following this approach with the updated covers for the Lizzie Ballard books, but rather than a cover designer having to start from scratch each time they do a new book in a series, it seems as if readers are accepting of and maybe even looking for more consistency. So you make a few tweaks from cover to cover, but the designer isn't having to start from scratch each time, which I think could be a more efficient and more
Yeah.
cost-effective way of indie authors getting covers if what I'm saying is true.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in some situations where you have serials, that is, and by serial I mean a story which follows essentially the same group of characters over perhaps three or four or even more books. And there is a sort of an overall story arc, and the focus is on that, which we see in a number of situations. So at the moment, short romance, just to take a quick diversion, short romance has a few different segments in it. Some of it is the sort of fairly steamy instant attraction thing, but there's also, and this has been fairly recent, quite a lot of serial which have very, very similar covers. And the reason I bring this up, Maddie, is to pick up on your point about the similarity of covers. In that situation, the covers are so similar that I actually thought they were all the same cover from a distance, in a montage or in the sort of thumbnail size thing you get in an ad. They all look like the same book. And it's not until and it seems to work, but it's not until you actually look at the thing that it will sort of say book 5 or book 4 or something like that. So the focus there, if you're a serial writer, is much more on reinforcing the brand of the serial as a whole. And of course, a lot of them are in KU. So it's easy for people to pick up the next one and the next one and to keep reading, to reinforce the brand of the serial as a whole, rather than to differentiate the books in the serial, because if people come to the book and they think, oh, hang on, this is book 5 and I haven't read book 3 yet, they're just going to go back to book 3. They're much less likely to kind of give up. So different. I think the take-home message that I'm trying to get to there, Maddie, is that your choices, listeners' choices about cover design, whether it's for standalones or series, are affected not only by your comps, but also by the reading habits of people in your genre, whether they prefer to read sort of long books or whether they prefer to read in KU or wide or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another good takeaway for people would be whatever tool they're using, whether that would be an email like BookBub emails or other tools, that when you see a cover from an author that you would consider a comp author that you really like, just copy that off into a little, a little electronic bulletin board, because it can be very informative. That's how I ended up landing on the redesign that I wanted, because I started seeing this emerging trend in thriller type covers. Like, oh, that's pretty cool. And so I, collected half a dozen that I really liked, and I was able to send that to my cover designer and say, I want something like this because this seems
Yeah.
to be the emerging trend. And I
Yeah,
figure I'll be good
absolutely.
for 5 years and then I'll have to redo it again.
Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, one per 5 years, that's probably okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So keep another great tip, I think, for listeners is keep a crib file, sorry, like a file of all of the things that you like, which are relevant to you in terms of your comps, turns of phrase, advertising, sort of taglines, log lines for books, and also covers, of course. Sign up to one of those free services like Notion or Airtable or, any of them. And you will quickly, if you do that sort of once a week, you'll quickly end up with whole lot of stuff that you can use to start making decisions. Because I think in the past, when I've tried to recover things or rewrite my blurbs, I've sort of started from a blank slate, and it was a long way up the hill, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got a bunch of other stuff that people are doing, and you think, oh, that's cool, or wow, I wish I'd come up with that, that makes it that much easier for you to get into the groove of what it is you're actually trying to do when you're rewriting blurbs. Because I know we haven't talked about blurbs very much this time, Maddie, but again, that's the thing. Blurbs drift, they change just the same way covers do, and for exactly the same reasons. So they are something that it's worth revisiting periodically to see what the other blurbs in your neighborhood are saying to readers, And they're also cheaper, arguably cheaper and easier to work on than covers.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen that's very interesting is when like ChatGPT started to be all the rage. And I would do things like I would take my existing blurb and I would put it into ChatGPT and I would say, like, rewrite this as in the style of a best-selling thriller
Yep.
or mystery or suspense novel.
Yep.
And, a lot of times the information I got back was quite good. But I realized that there's like an identifiable ChatGPT style.
Yep.
And so it's just it's an argument for using these things as a tool, not for the final product. Because what I did find is that I would think like, oh, that's a word. Like, it's using a word that I hadn't thought of. I'm going to incorporate that word. But I think as people get more sophisticated about the kinds of information that AI platforms like ChatGPT put out, then they're going to read something and it's going to be clearer that where it's coming from, because there would be there were very identifiable ways that it would close out the blurb. And it sounded okay to me the first time, but after I read 3 or 4, I was like, oh, no.
In stats, it's called regression to the mean, Matty.
Yeah,
and a lot of those LLM text generation things, it's very much regression to the mean, where it looks good the first time and looks pretty good the second time, and then you do it a few times and you start to look in the store and you realize how many other blurbs are like that, and you're like, wait a minute, you're not being as creative as you kind of implied you were, buddy.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely a great way to, I think, help if you're creatively blocked, but generally much better if you use it as a starting point rather than as an ending point. The other tip that I have, if you don't mind me mentioning, Matty, which I know I've mentioned before, is when I get people to evaluate stuff, I never send it like a blurb. I never send them one blurb and say, do you like it or tell me what's wrong? I always send them 3, not 2, but 3. And I say, rank these in the order that you prefer. And this
That's a great
has
tip.
a bunch. Yeah, this has a bunch. Now, maybe one of them is your real one and 2 of them are kind of crappy ones that you just got ChatGPT to do. Doesn't matter. Don't tell anyone that. Just present them neutrally. But the reason I do this is because people often find it much easier to rank things in order of their preference than to say specifically that they do or don't like something. Because in a way, saying whether they do or don't like something is a little bit of an emotive decision, And if you don't like something, then it's sort of incumbent upon you to articulate why. A lot of people don't like giving feedback that is along the lines of, I don't really like this, but I've got no idea why. And yet that's actually a valid feeling, particularly if it's something that a reader might have. Whereas if you give your blurbs to sort of 5 people and they all rank a particular blurb bottom of 3, probably don't use that one. Like, whatever else is going on, that's probably not the blurb you want to use. If there's one, what I find usually is that there is one that when I've done this, there's one that nobody likes. And sometimes it's the one that I thought was good. And rarely there is one that everyone thinks is the best. And in that situation, you go with your own intuition and your experience and stuff. But yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great advice. When we were talking about, I haven't given you a chance to talk about fantasy books specifically but I think that the generic stuff is great because then everybody can apply it to their own circumstances. But this is one where we might end up diving into fantasy as an example a little bit. But you had said key topics is another piece of data people should be looking at. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by key topics?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is trying to understand what in a book that is resonating with readers. We use words like tropes and archetypes and settings and themes and so forth. And those are all, they're all perfectly valid words, and I use them a lot. But for me, they're all trying to answer the same question, which is, what's in this book? What am I going to get when I read it? And our blurbs, of course, are one of the main things, as well as the title and the cover. Those are the instruments by which we signal to readers what you're going to get. What's the emotional experience you're going to get when you pick up a book? Readers have their own language about doing this, and it's not always the same one that we do. And it's very genre specific. I think that's maybe a bit of a statement of the obvious, but one of the things that I try to do when I'm looking at a genre is to say, what does this specific word mean in this genre? So to give you an example, I'm looking at the fantasy, a list of sort of key topics in the top 200 fantasy books at the moment. And I'm seeing there's some kind of obvious ones like supernatural and dragons and fae and elves. And yeah, it's not surprising that those, but I'm also seeing an interesting one, which is military. And the reason that I've sort of collected these things together is to get a general sense of what's going on. So in this case, in the fantasy books, if a book has any mention of military units or military words, so generals and corporals and captains or battalions or, strategy, those kinds of things, I kind of group them all into one topic. So what I'm trying to do is to get a general sense of what's going on. But in the case, this came to me this morning, the use of those military words in a fantasy blurb, it means something different to the way it might mean something in, say, a mystery blurb. So if you see military words in a fantasy blurb, I think that's more likely to imply that there is a battle in the book, or that there is a historical mention of battles or something like that. Whereas in a mystery book, you might see quite a lot of military words, but they're often referring to characters. They're often referring to someone who has a military background, or in the case of a thriller book, maybe there's some sort of plot which involves implications to do with the military or taking over a country, or that kind of thing. So that's a good example where certain words, like military words, are going to imply different things to readers depending on your genre. And we can see this in a lot of other different situations as well, but that's a really good kind of takeaway one. So I guess my takeaways for readers here are, think about how you can, when you're reading your comps and looking at the other top books in a genre, think about how you can generalize what's in the book. Actually, you can use any set of words. I don't think it matters, as long as you're kind of consistent. I love arguing about tropes as much as the next genre nerd, but in truth, as long as, if you're doing it for your own research, it doesn't really matter that it's perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. All you have to do is to come up with things so you can group, like get a list of 10 blurbs and say, okay, I think the common factors in these blurbs are these things, and here's how they're different. Turns out 5 of them are like this, and 5 of them are like that, and I want my book to be one of that 5 because it's signifying the same things.
Yeah, I think that any of these conversations about comparing one's own books to what you think are the comps, if you're seeing a disconnect, there are 2 things you could do. One is to adjust your writing or your blurbs or your cover or whatever to be more like those comps that you're looking for. But I think the other thing that's always important to point out is you may have picked the wrong genre. I think that writers are notoriously bad at understanding their own genre because they're writing from their heart. Many writers are writing, oh, I want to write a military fantasy book, but some are just writing a story and then they're stepping back and saying, what is this? And so if you're stepping back and looking and you're seeing a disconnect, maybe it's not a matter of changing what you're doing to match what you thought were the comps. Maybe it's a lesson that your comps are different than you thought. And if your blurb or your tropes or your cover is looking more like something else, maybe you just need to recategorize the genre that you've put your
Yeah,
book
yeah.
in.
Yeah, totally. The way that I guess I would put it is that at the moment, it might be that the current conventions and reader expectations of that genre are not a fit for the story that you're telling. And it might be that other conventions and other expectations in another genre at the moment are better, because we know that genres are constantly on the move and reader expectations are constantly on the move. And so it doesn't mean that your book is kind of doomed. It doesn't mean that it's never going to find a readership. It just means that the expectations of what's resonating with people right now in that area, they aren't a fit for what you're doing. So there's a lot of other areas, and sometimes it can take a bit of work to go and find those other areas. Maybe this is where I can talk about this concept that I've been thinking of to do with a neighborhood. That is, the neighborhood of your books is not just your genre or your subgenre, and it's not just your comps. For me, it's actually the things that make your comps and your subgenre what they are. It is the language that people around you, your authors around you, use in their blurbs. It's the visual elements that they use on covers to signify particular things. So we'll be able to see that a visual element in one genre signifies one thing, same visual element, different genre, different signification. It might also, your neighborhood as an author might also include some of the other products that your readers are interested in. So, for instance, if you have a fantasy, and this is kind of a statement of the obvious, but if you have a fantasy reader, they are much more likely to be interested in fantasy TV shows. So your neighborhood also, in that case, include fantasy TV shows. It might also include podcasts or video casts about fantasy. Now, I'm not saying all of this to sort of overwhelm listeners and to say, hey, you've got to spend all your time keeping up with all of this other media rather than writing, but rather to encourage people to think of their neighborhood as being kind of a broad thing, which includes the books that people are reading, but it also includes the language that they're using and what emotions are being triggered when they read books, for instance. And my argument, the reason why I'm talking about this is because I think the important business decisions are actually made in that micro environment. They're actually made in your neighborhood much more than about generally what's happening in your genre. So in mystery or in fantasy, there will be some big trends, but my argument is actually it's the little trends, the things that are happening close to you, which are the ones that really affect the day-to-day business decisions you make as an author, like your covers. Your example before, Matty, of how your reader expectations for books like yours have changed in terms of covers. That's a great example, because if you were just looking at all mystery books, that might not be so obvious.
Yeah. So we've been talking, I think that the conversation about neighborhood is hopefully a good entree to the last topic I wanted to discuss, which is categories. So I can imagine that neighborhood and categories has a connection, but how direct a connection are there between those two concepts?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a bit cliche to say this, but a lot is discussed about categories on the Kindle store and on the wide stores as well, although generally the wide stores don't have the same level of detail, I think, in terms of how many categories they have. Whether that's a bad thing or not, I'm not sure, but sometimes I think it's not a bad thing at all. But one thing's for sure, there are a heck of a lot of categories on the Amazon store, and they are, the way I see them is actually they're a way of teaching Amazon what books your books are like. They are the most direct way of teaching Amazon about your comps. And I think that's why they are important. I think they're less important in the sense of the sort of, what's the word, objective description of what's in your book. I think what matters is when you're looking at categories, where are the books that you want to be next to? Those are the categories that you should be in, if you know what I mean. Even if you don't think, even if the label on top of the category isn't quite how you describe your book, I'd urge listeners to sort of take a pragmatic approach and to say, okay, well, this category, when I look at the top 100 or I follow it for a bit, I see that this category includes a lot of my comps, and the language, the visual language and the language of blurbs in this category is a fit for what I'm doing. So that's the category for me, even if the name of the category isn't what you personally see as being your book, because ultimately all of that metadata is a way of teaching Amazon who to show your book to with the greatest chance that they're going to like it. And when we go down into a lot of these categories, a lot of them are actually pretty arbitrary. So just looking at fantasy, Obviously, most books in the top 200 in fantasy have at least one category in fantasy, but there are also a fair chunk, so what, 25% of them have a romance category as well. A bit more than 25% are in one of the literature and fiction categories, so mythology and folk tales and so on and so forth. Now, is that where you want to be? Well, that depends, but it's always worth looking at the other categories that are kind of around yours. And listeners, I'm sure know that when you go to a book on the Amazon store, you can scroll down, and when you go to about halfway down the page, you'll see the 3 top ranked categories for a book. Again, I would put those in your crib file that we talked about a little bit earlier, and I'd make a note of those categories and go and investigate them when you can, because you might find that there are some other categories as well as the obvious ones which are a good fit for your book.
That's great. Yeah, especially now, because I think that Amazon's sort of trying to get its hands around this idea. You had suggested that maybe more categories isn't necessarily a good thing. And some of the changes that they're making recently, I think, suggest that they also agree that, more categories are not necessarily a good thing. And I think it's incentive for people to think about it more carefully than maybe they would have in the past.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe what's happened is that there was a huge explosion of them when ebook reading took off, and so they were added a lot. I don't know, Matty, if you've ever. This is probably a me thing. I don't know if you've ever looked at all of the categories under mystery, thriller, and suspense, like the thriller ones and stuff. Boy, there are a lot of them,
Yeah.
and boy, I don't know what the difference is. And I
Yeah.
mean, you could sort of invent one, but then you go and look, and in actual fact, in the top sort of 100 or 200, there's a lot of overlap. So what that's telling me is I don't think readers really know either, but doesn't change the fact that at the moment, the important thing to do is go and find the ones where your comps are most likely represented, and like find the ones that are within your neighborhood and stick with them. It may be that there will be a reduction in categories in future, because I don't think that readers really browse by category. I think this is, pure speculation, but I suspect most buying decisions are made by books being shown to readers, and the things that we talked about before, the visual language of the cover, the language of the blurb, those are the things that give a reader a buying decision. I don't believe that many readers come to new books and new authors by browsing categories. So the take-home messages, they're still important, but they are important indirectly rather than directly, because they can teach Amazon who our books should be shown to, so they then make the buying decision.
Yeah. And I like that idea of looking at it both ways. Go to the category and see what other books are there, but then also look at the books that you consider
And
to
then,
be comps, and go backwards and see what categories
Yep.
they're putting themselves in. So we've talked about lots of great information, some of which would be quite labor intensive to collect manually. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about a less manual way that people can get the information that we've been
Aw.
talking about.
Thank you, Matty. So there's a few things. The first one is, and I hope we can fit all of this in the show notes, I have a bunch of free tools for the author community that make collecting information quite easy. I've got a Chrome browser extension where you can download cover montages and data about the top 100, and also about your also boughts. We didn't get time to talk very much about also boughts, but when they're around, because they come and go, they are a really important part of understanding what's going on in your neighborhood, because they are the thing that readers are prepared to pay money for. And they don't have to be your also bought. They might be the also boughts of your comps, or also boughts of an author to whom you aspire to be like, or whatever. Go and look at those when you can find them, because that's, to me, they are the most concrete aspect of reader behavior, because it involves putting down some money, and that's what really counts. So I have a tool which allows you to download all of the also boughts from a particular book very quickly and easily. What I also do, though, to help people keep up with what's going on in their neighborhood, is make an author newsletter called Kindletrends. And this is a subscription thing. I'll give you a discount code just at the end. But the idea is that you sign up, and every week or every month, I send to your inbox a quick description of what's going on in your genre of interest, or genres of interest. There's 14 different ones, and you get links to everything that's trending on the Kindle store. and suggestions about books to look at because they've just come out and they're shooting up the charts and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to do is to take a lot of the donkey work of research out and make it so you can, as the author, spend all the time doing the stuff that only you can do, which is reading and understanding how it fits with you.
Yeah, I'm a subscriber of Kindletrends, and just as one example, one way that I've used it recently is when I was rethinking my pricing. It was great to be able to go into the Kindletrends newsletter and see the breakdown of in the top 100 how many books were priced at each price level. And of course, I could have come up with that eventually myself, but it is super nice just to open a newsletter and have it right there for you.
Yeah, yeah. So I know I've said this to you before, Matty, but my kind of 30-second description is it is like the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times for working fiction authors, that if you've got 30 seconds, you can just read the front bit, you can read the headlines. If you want to dig into a specific thing that's going on in your genre, then it's all laid out for you there as well. I've got a bunch of videos showing you how to do things and some examples of how to do research in your genre and to keep up with what's going on using Kindletrends as a base. And all of the data, I want to take a moment to mention that all of the data is available to you. So if you want to go and do your own thing, if you really like using Excel, people like that do exist. If you really like doing that kind of thing, then, hey, look, I'm very much an open data advocate. So I try to make things straightforward for authors, but also if you want to know why something is the way it is or why I'm recommending things, there's no black boxes. It's all laid out there for you, and you can go through the reasoning yourself and come to a different conclusion if you want. That's one of the things I'm really trying to advocate now, is the idea that we can have kind of roundtable discussions in a genre community about what's going on. And we might agree or we might disagree about what's going to happen, but we've all got a common evidence base of the information that I've gathered. And I think that's really important. And it's a lot of fun too.
Yeah, that's so great. Well, Nat, thank you so much. It's always lovely to chat with you, and let people know where they can go to find out more about you and Kindletrends and the discount code online.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me about that. So I am at kindletrends.com, and that's where you'll find all the free resources. We'll put some of the link in the show notes. For listeners of the Indy Author Podcast, I have a special deal, which is if you use the code Indy Author, then you will get a, 33% discount. So normally Kindletrends is $15 US a month flat. Never changes. There's no upselling, no premium tiers. There will never be any of those kinds of things. That's my commitment. It's one price. That's it. But if you are a listener of the Indy Author Podcast, then you can put in the coupon Indy Author and you get it for $10 US a month forever.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks very much, Matty. It's been a lot of fun.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Nat. When you consider your own book's cover, blurb, conventions, and other aspects Nat mentioned, do you feel like they're in the right neighborhood along with the books you consider comps? If not, are there steps you might take to address that? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And be sure to check out Nat's previous episode, 122, Using Data to Guide Your Craft, which is a great companion piece to this one. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.